Gojo vs Sukuna remains to be one of the most controversial fights, not in just Jujutsu Kaisen, but in all of anime as a whole. And despite Sukuna being the victor of the fight, till this day, people still have countless amounts of debates between who is stronger between the two, and all of this stems from how Sukuna went about winning the fight. So what could Sukuna have done to make his fight with Gojo so controversial? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to the very beginning of the series. Within the first few chapters, Sukuna states that once he makes Yuji Itadori's body his, he will then kill Gojo. However, flash forward a few hundred chapters later, and Sukuna now takes over Megumi Fushigoro's body. So now we get to the fight between him and Gojo, and throughout the entirety of the fight, Sukuna is using Megumi's abilities and his Ten Shadow technique in order to give himself more of an advantage over Gojo. And as a result of this, people weren't too happy about it. People were saying things like, oh, Sukuna is relying on another person's curse technique to win. Sukuna isn't strong enough by himself in order to beat Gojo. He's being carried by Megumi's abilities. He's being carried by Mahoraga. Every single thing was getting thrown against Sukuna. However, the question is, did Sukuna really need the 10 Shadows? Did he really get carried by Mahoraga? Or could he have won against Gojo without even needing the 10 Shadows? Let's talk about it. Now, I know a lot of you are going to be saying, oh, Tizzy, obviously Sukuna needed Mahoraga. How else would he have bypassed Gojo's infinity? Well, here's the problem with that. Sukuna already had ways to bypass Gojo's infinity without Mahoraga, one of which was domain expansion. Now then you might say, oh, Sukuna already tried using domain expansion and it didn't work. Well, him and Gojo spent 4 chapters fighting inside of Sukuna's domain, and Gojo's infinity was off the entire time, and yet all Sukuna did was just fight Gojo hand to hand. He didn't use any of his other curse techniques. He didn't activate his black box abilities to overwhelm Gojo inside of his own domain expansion. No, instead he was just fighting Gojo hand to hand and was just waiting for Gojo's infinity to turn back on. So if Sukuna really wanted to, don't you think he would have just stuck to using domain expansion in order to bypass Gojo's infinity and would have just overwhelmed him with his own abilities inside of it? You see, I don't think Sukuna ever needed Mahoraga to bypass Gojo's infinity because he could have done that himself. So you might be wondering, why else would Sukuna need Mahoraga then? Well, it was to learn how to bypass Gojo's infinity. You see, there's a big difference between simply bypassing Gojo's infinity and learning how to bypass Gojo's infinity. To learn how to bypass Gojo's infinity, that's when you understand his infinity on a fundamental level, and you can create your own techniques in order to bypass it instead of just relying on negating techniques like domain amplification or domain expansion. Because negating is not the same thing as just learning how to counter it. And when you think about this narratively, this makes perfect sense, because if Sukuna simply needed Mahoraga to bypass Gojo's infinity, he would have finished the fight a few chapters earlier. But he stated in chapter 236 that the first time Mahoraga adapted, he did it in a way that Sukuna could not replicate. So he waited for Mahoraga to adapt again in order to learn how Mahoraga did it so he himself could do it. If it was all about just bypassing Gojo's infinity, he would have had Mahoraga just take out Gojo the moment he adapted. But he didn't do that. He first wanted to learn how Mahoraga was doing it and wanted to replicate it, which is how he learned his world slash technique. And narratively, this also makes a lot of sense when you understand who Sukuna is as a character. He is a character who is interested by things that he has not seen before. A prime example is Higuruma. He was interested in Higuruma's Executioner's Blade, and once he learned the full extent of it, he got rid of Higuruma. So it makes sense for him to want to learn how infinity works rather than just taking out Gojo the moment he gets the chance to. Now then you might say, oh, but Mahoraga actually saved Sukuna on multiple occasions throughout his fight with Gojo. The first time was when Sukuna got hit by Unlimited Void and Mahoraga came in and broke it. And then the second time was when Gojo knocked Sukuna out and Mahoraga again interfered with the fight. However, Sukuna would not have been placed into those positions if, again, he wasn't actively trying to learn how Gojo's infinity works. Sukuna deliberately put himself in harm's way just to understand how Gojo's infinity works. And for those of you who would say that Sukuna wouldn't do this, Sukuna most definitely would. This guy is the definition of a risk taker. Back during the Colon Games, when he switched from Yuji's body to Megumi's, Sukuna literally states, "I didn't know if this would work." He was gambling his own life on a chance, and that chance thankfully paid off for him. But he himself didn't know if he was going to survive the transfer there. And that's because he made a binding vow with Yuji that he can't hurt any of Yuji's friends, and he didn't know if that binding vow included Yuji himself. So he took a massive gamble by slashing off his own fingers because there was a chance that he would have just straight up died in that moment. So Sukuna would 100% put himself in harm's way and risk everything if it meant that there was a benefit for him in the end. Another thing that should confirm that Sukuna did not need 10 shadows to beat Gojo is Gojo himself stating in chapter 236 that he doesn't know if he would have been able to beat Sukuna even if Sukuna wasn't using the 10 shadows. This is Gojo himself admitting that. So how could somebody read that and then go on to say, oh yeah, Sukuna got completely carried by Megumi's 10 shadows and would have definitely lost without it? And there's just straight up statements admitting that Sukuna was still holding back a large portion of his power. So you can't really make the claim that Sukuna got carried by 10 shadows. He had ways of beating Gojo without 10 shadows, but again, his main priority was simply to learn how Gojo's infinity operates so he himself could bypass it without just simply negating it with domain expansion. So did Sukuna get carried by Megumi's 10 shadows? I don't think so. A lot of people think he was using it as a crutch. He was simply using it as a tool, as he admitted in chapter 236. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and make sure to like and subscribe and let me know what other videos you guys want to see in the future. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys on the next one.